In the turbulent, high-stakes universe of the bold and the beautiful, there are moments when every thread of tension, every hidden fear, every unspoken guilt converges into a single, catastrophic event. These are the moments when the story stops being about choices and becomes about consequences, raw, immediate, and impossible to escape. What began as a desperate search, a spiral of suspicion and obsession, now erupted into something far more violent, far more final. And for those caught in its path, nothing would ever be the same again. The road along the cliffside had always carried a quiet danger. It curved sharply, hugging the edge of a drop that seemed to stretch endlessly into the jagged rocks below. The ocean roared in the distance, its relentless rhythm a reminder of forces far beyond human control. On that day, the sky hung low and gray, the air thick with tension, as if the world itself anticipated what was about to unfold. Will Spencer drove with a singular focus that bordered on desperation. Every clue he had uncovered, every fragment of truth he had pieced together, had led him here. The images on the walls, the letter, the button in the office, each one a step deeper into a reality he could no longer deny. Somewhere ahead of him was the answer. Somewhere ahead of him was Melissa Dillon. And he would not stop. Not now. Not when he was this close. But he was not alone on that road. Ahead, just barely within sight, another vehicle cut through the curve with erratic precision. It moved too fast, too aggressively, as though the driver had nothing left to lose, or everything to protect. Will's eyes narrowed as recognition hit him, sharp and immediate. Remy Price. The name alone sent a surge of adrenaline through him. This was it. The confrontation he had been racing toward, the collision between hunter and hunted, though in this moment it was impossible to say which was which. Will pressed harder on the accelerator, his grip tightening around the wheel as the distance between them began to close. Remy noticed. Of course he did. He always did. The car ahead swerved slightly, then accelerated, the intent unmistakable. This was no longer movement, it was flight. And Will, driven by equal parts fear and determination, followed without hesitation. The road became a blur of motion and sound, the engine roaring beneath him as the cliffside loomed ever closer. What happened next unfolded in seconds. But those seconds stretched, elongated by adrenaline, by instinct, by the desperate need to react. Remy's vehicle veered sharply, cutting across the lane in a maneuver too sudden, too aggressive to avoid cleanly. Will tried to adjust, tried to compensate, but physics had already taken over. The impact came with a violent force that shattered the fragile illusion of control. Metal screamed. Glass exploded. The world tilted. Will's car spun, skidding dangerously close to the edge before the momentum carried it over. For a brief, suspended moment, everything seemed to stop, the vehicle hanging at the brink, balanced between gravity and motion. And then it fell. The descent was chaotic, brutal, the car flipping, rolling, crashing against the unforgiving rock face before coming to a twisted, broken halt. Silence followed, heavy and unnatural, broken only by the distant echo of the ocean below. Above, the aftermath continued. Remy's vehicle, though damaged, had not gone over the edge. It sat at an angle across the road, its engine still running, smoke curling from the hood. For a moment, there was stillness. Then movement. Sirens. The police had arrived. What followed was swift, precise, controlled, a stark contrast to the chaos that had just unfolded. Officers moved in, weapons drawn, voices sharp and commanding as they surrounded the vehicle. There was no room left for escape. No space left for negotiation. Remy stepped out slowly. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, something fractured, something unhinged. Whether it was defeat or calculation was impossible to tell. His hands were raised, his movements deliberate, as if he understood that this moment had been inevitable. The cuffs clicked into place with a finality that echoed louder than the crash. It should have been the end, but it wasn't, because then one of the officers moved toward the back of the vehicle. There was hesitation. a flicker of uncertainty, and then shock. The trunk was opened, and what they found inside silenced everything. Melissa Dillon,
Bound.
her wrists tightly secured, her body restrained in a way that spoke of prolonged captivity. A cloth gag muffled any sound she might have made, her eyes wide with terror, unfocused yet painfully aware. She was alive, but barely holding on to any sense of stability. The fear etched into her expression was not momentary. It was the result of something sustained, something that had broken through her defenses again and again until only raw instinct remained. The officers reacted immediately, their professionalism cutting through the horror of the scene. They moved to free her, to remove the restraints, to bring her back into a space where she could breathe, where she could begin to understand that the immediate threat was over. But Dillon did not relax. Even as the gag was removed, even as the ropes were cut, her body remained rigid, her mind struggling to catch up with the shift in reality. Her breaths came in short, uneven bursts, her gaze darting wildly, as though expecting the nightmare to reassert itself at any moment. Freedom, in that instant, felt unreal. And somewhere beyond that moment, beyond the police, beyond the road, beyond the wreckage, there was Will. The realization hit almost simultaneously. Dillon was safe, but Will was not. Emergency responders were already working at the base of the cliff, their movements urgent, coordinated, driven by the understanding that time was not on their side. The wreckage of the car told its own story, of impact, of force, of damage far beyond superficial injury. When they reached him, the severity of his condition became immediately clear. Unconscious, unresponsive, blood matted in his hair, evidence of trauma to the head that left little room for optimism. Every second mattered, every action critical as they worked to stabilize him, to extract him from the twisted metal that had become both his prison and his shield. Above, word began to spread, and it reached Electra Forrester like a shockwave. By the time she arrived, the scene was already in motion, sirens, flashing lights, controlled chaos. But none of that registered fully. Her focus narrowed to a single point, the stretcher, the body on it, the unmistakable presence of someone she loved lying dangerously close to the edge of something irreversible. Will. Her voice broke as she ran forward, the name tearing from her with a desperation that cut through everything else. The sight of him, still, fragile, barely clinging to life, shattered whatever composure she might have held. This was not fear in the abstract. This was loss, imminent and undeniable. She reached for him, her hands trembling, her mind refusing to accept what her eyes were telling her. The paramedics worked around her, their focus unwavering, but the world for Electra had already narrowed to that single, unbearable truth. He might not survive. The thought was too large, too final, too impossible to hold without breaking. And so she did break, her voice rising, her grief spilling outward in raw, uncontrollable waves. There was no restraint, no attempt to contain it, because there was nothing left to contain. Nearby, R.J. Forrester stood motionless. He had arrived expecting confrontation, perhaps resolution, but not this. Not the aftermath of violence, not the tangible consequences of actions that had once seemed abstract, distant, manageable. Now they were real, too real. His eyes fixed on the scene, taking in every detail, the wreckage, the blood, the desperation. And beneath that, something deeper began to surface.
Guilt.
It did not come quietly. It surged up, uninvited, undeniable, forcing him to confront the role he had played, not directly, perhaps, but undeniably. His suspicions, his interference, the decisions he had made, believing he was protecting, believing he was acting in the best interest of those around him. And now someone might die. Because of it. Or, at least, that was how it felt. The human mind, when faced with tragedy, searches for cause, for responsibility, for something it can hold on to in the chaos. For RJ, that search turned inward. Every harsh word he had spoken, every accusation, every attempt to control the situation replayed in his mind with brutal clarity. Had he made things worse? Had his actions pushed events toward this inevitable collision? He did not know, but the possibility alone was enough to paralyze him. Aswell was lifted into the ambulance, his fate uncertain, suspended between life and something far more final, the emotional landscape around him fractured into something unrecognizable. Dylan, newly freed yet deeply shaken, struggled to reconcile her survival with the cost it had demanded. Electra, consumed by fear and grief, clung to the fragile hope that love might still be enough to pull Will back from the edge. RJ stood in silence, caught between shock and self-reproach, unable to move forward, unable to retreat. And Remy, now restrained, watched it all with an expression that defied simple interpretation. Whether there was regret, satisfaction, or something else entirely lurking beneath the surface, no one could say. But one thing was certain. This was not the end. It was a turning point. Because survival in a moment like this is not just about the body. It is about what remains after. And as the ambulance doors closed, carrying Will Spencer into an uncertain future, the question that lingered was not just whether he would live. It was what his survival, or his loss, would mean for everyone left behind. Because in this world, where love and betrayal intertwine, where every choice carries consequences that ripple outward, nothing happens in isolation. And the impact of this moment had only just begun. In the relentless emotional terrain of the bold and the beautiful, survival is rarely a clean victory. It does not arrive wrapped in relief or resolution. Instead, it brings with it the debris of everything that came before, the secrets, the guilt, the damage that cannot be undone. When the chaos of violence subsides, when the sirens fade and the immediate danger retreats, what remains is often far more difficult to confront. Truth. And truth, in this case, would not heal. It would destroy. When Melissa Dillon was pulled from the back of Remy Price's vehicle, her body may have been freed, but her mind remained trapped in something far more enduring. By the time she arrived at the hospital, the world around her had already begun to blur into something indistinct, fragmented. The harsh white lights, the voices of doctors and nurses, the controlled urgency of medical care. All of it felt distant, as though she were observing it from somewhere outside herself. Shock has a way of creating distance, but distance cannot last forever. As the immediate medical assessments concluded and the physical restraints were replaced by something less visible but no less binding, Dillon began to collapse, not outwardly, not with dramatic display, but inwardly, where the damage had already taken root. Her hands trembled even when still. Her breathing remained uneven, as though her body had forgotten the rhythm of safety. And her eyes, once steady, observant, now carried the unmistakable weight of something buried too long. She had been living with it, carrying it, and now there was no space left to hide it. The police arrived not long after. Their presence was calm, procedural, but it carried an undeniable gravity. Questions needed answers. A narrative needed to be constructed from the fragments left behind. What had happened, why it had happened, how it had escalated into something so violent. These were not just matters of curiosity. They were matters of consequence. Dillon knew that. And for a long moment, she said nothing. Silence in that hospital room was not empty. It was heavy, filled with hesitation, with fear, with the awareness that once she spoke, there would be no returning to the version of herself that had existed before. Confession is not just an act of telling. It is an act of transformation. Because once the truth is spoken, it cannot be contained. Her voice, when it finally came, was fragile but clear. It did not tremble from uncertainty. It trembled from inevitability. "I didn't have a choice," she said. The words were not a defense. They were a beginning. As she spoke, the story unfolded, not in a single, coherent narrative, but in fragments that gradually aligned into something far more disturbing than anyone in that room had anticipated. Remy Price had not simply appeared in her life recently. He had been there longer than anyone realized, embedded in her past, connected to something she had fought desperately to leave behind. And at the center of that past was a name.
Luna no Saba.
The air in the room seemed to shift as Dylan spoke it. There are names that carry weight beyond their syllables, names that hold memory, consequence, unresolved questions. Luna's was one of them. Her death had not been a simple event. It had been complicated, shadowed by uncertainty, by whispers of things not fully understood. And now, Dylan was connected to it. The revelation did not come as a single, explosive statement. It emerged slowly, painfully, as though each word had to be forced through layers of resistance. Dylan did not speak in absolutes. She spoke in admissions of presence, of knowledge, of involvement that she had never intended to resurface. Remy had known, and he had used it. The blackmail had not been about money alone. That had been the surface, the distraction, the element that made the threat appear ordinary. But beneath it was something far more powerful, leverage rooted in fear. Remy had understood exactly what Dylan stood to lose if the truth about Luna came to light. Her career, her reputation, her fragile sense of redemption, her future. So he had given her a choice that was not a choice at all.
Comply.
Or be exposed. Dylan's voice broke slightly as she described the pressure, the constant presence of that threat shaping every decision she made. She had tried to resist at first, had tried to find a way out, but the net had already tightened. Every attempt to escape only reinforced the reality that Remy had control, not just over her actions, but over her story. And then came the moment that changed everything. The parking lot at Forrester Creations. It had seemed like any other moment, any other transition between the ordinary and the expected. But Remy had been there, waiting, prepared to escalate things beyond manipulation into something physical, immediate, irreversible. He had come for her, not as a threat this time, but as an execution of everything he had been building toward. Dylan described it in fragments, the suddenness of it, the shock, the realization that this was no longer something she could manage or delay. It was happening, and she was alone.
Or she would have been.
If not for Will Spencer. His presence in that moment was not planned, not calculated. It was instinct. He saw what was happening and acted, not with hesitation, not with consideration of the risk, but with a clarity that comes only when someone chooses to protect without thinking of the cost. He intervened. And in doing so, he changed the trajectory of everything. What followed was chaos, movement, struggle, the kind of uncontrolled escalation that leaves no room for careful decision-making. Dylan remembered flashes. Will's voice, urgent and determined. Remy's reaction, immediate and violent. The sense that the situation had tipped into something far beyond control. And then the crash. The aftermath. The hospital. Dylan's voice faltered as she reached that point, the weight of what had happened settling fully into the room. Will had not just been present. He had not just tried to help. He had put himself in harm's way. For her. The implication hung heavily in the air. Will Spencer now lay in critical condition, his life suspended between survival and loss, because he had chosen to step in, to stop something that Dylan had been unable to escape on her own. The guilt in that realization was immediate and overwhelming. For Dylan, it was suffocating. For the others in the room, it was something else. Anger. The first to embody it fully was Bill Spencer. When the truth reached him, it did not arrive as information. It arrived as provocation. Bill Spencer was not a man who processed pain quietly. His response to threat, to harm, to anything that touched those he loved, was immediate and absolute. And this was not just harm. This was a chain of events that had led his son to the edge of death. And at the center of that chain was Dylan. Her confession, however honest, however necessary, did not soften the reality in his eyes. It clarified it. It gave shape to something he could direct his anger toward. "You knew," he said, his voice low but carrying an unmistakable intensity. Dylan did not deny it. She could not. "And you didn't say anything." The accusation was not just about silence. It was about consequence. Bill's anger did not explode outward in uncontrolled rage. It sharpened, focused, became something far more dangerous, a promise. "This doesn't end here," he continued. And in those words, there was no ambiguity. He was not just seeking justice. He was declaring war. Not only on Remy, who had already been captured, already facing the legal consequences of his actions, but on anyone connected to the chain of events that had led to this moment. Anyone who had contributed, directly or indirectly, to the harm done to his son, including Dylan. The room shifted again, the tension escalating into something more volatile. The divide between the families, Logan, Forrester, Spencer, began to deepen, no longer defined by rivalry or disagreement, but by something far more permanent.
Blame.
Responsibility. Retribution. Dylan, already fractured by her confession, now found herself at the center of a new storm. Her truth, meant to release her from the weight of secrecy, had instead exposed her to something else entirely: accountability in its harshest form. Her career, everything she had built, everything she had worked to rebuild after the past she had tried to bury, stood on the brink of collapse. The industry she had fought to belong to would not easily forgive a connection to something as dark as Luna Nozawa's death, especially not when it had been hidden, manipulated, used as leverage. Reputation, once damaged, does not recover easily. And Dylan knew it. But even that loss felt secondary compared to something else.
Will.
His condition remained critical, the details sparse, the uncertainty overwhelming. Machines now did what his body struggled to do on its own. Doctors worked within the narrow margins that separated recovery from irreversible damage. And outside that room, everything continued to unravel. Katie Logan stood caught between grief and mediation, trying to hold together pieces that refused to align. Electra Forrester remained consumed by fear, her focus narrowed entirely to Will, to the fragile hope that he might still return to her. The connections between them, all of them, strained under the weight of what had been revealed. Because this was no longer just about one crime. It was about a history of secrets, of choices made under pressure, of silence that had allowed something dangerous to grow unchecked. And now, the consequences were unavoidable. The legal battle that Bill Spencer threatened was not an exaggeration. It was inevitable. Lawyers would become involved. Evidence would be examined. Responsibility would be assigned, argued, contested. The truth would be dissected, not for understanding, but for judgment. And in that process, no one would remain untouched. Dylan's confession had not ended the story. It had expanded it. What had once been a hidden struggle between her and Remy now became a public reckoning, one that would force every character involved to confront not only what had happened, but what it meant moving forward. Because in a world where power, loyalty, and ambition intersect, the line between victim and participant is rarely clear. And once that line is crossed, there is no simple way back. Only forward. Into consequence. Into conflict. Into a future defined not by what was intended, but by what was done. And as Will Spencer lay suspended between life and death, the question that lingered over everything was not just whether he would survive. It was